Good afternoon. Welcome to the State Historical Society. I'm Marv Bergman. I edit the Annals of Iowa for the State Historical Society, and one of the things I'm most proud of during my tenure here is the quantity and quality of stories we've been able to uncover of African American history. And I've pulled out a number of the issues we've published just since 2000 that feature articles on African Americans. If you want to take a look afterwards, those can be purchased, or you can subscribe to the journal. We want to thank Channel 4, the city government channel, for filming these events. They will eventually be up and available. The last one is up and ready to be viewed at this point, and this one will be eventually. We also want to thank the University of Iowa Press for cooperating with us in this event. This is a new partnership, and we are really glad to be doing it. We'll be having another one of these partnership events in just 3 weeks, when Tom Baker will be talking based on his book, The Sacred Cause of Union, Iowa and the Civil War, another brand new book from the University of Iowa Press. Our presenters today are Lena and Michael Hill. Lena is Senior Associate to the President of the University of Iowa and Associate Professor of English and African American Studies. She is the author of Visualizing Blackness and the Creation of African American Literary Tradition, and is co-author with Michael of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man Reference Guide. Just an aside here, I can't resist. This book is one that somehow escaped my attention during my liberal arts education, and I just read it this past summer, and I highly recommend it. It's a book you really ought to take a look at. And I also would say, come on in, Michael. I also would say, if you can get a hold of the audio version, there's an audio version with just a remarkable performance by the reader in the audio version. Listen to at least part of it that way. So that's Lena. Michael, who just arrived, is Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa, and he's the author of The Ethics of Swagger, prize-winning African American novels, 1977 to 1993. Welcome, Michael and Lena, and they'll be talking based on their book, Invisible Hawkeyes, African Americans at the University of Iowa during the long civil rights era.
Thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank the State Historical Society of Iowa for hosting us, and specifically Marv. We have so enjoyed presenting on this material, particularly because every time we have the chance to talk about it with a different group, it begins a conversation that inevitably leads us to new discoveries, and we are very much hoping to continue collecting these stories on a website that we're working on. So it's really nice to have a work that is open-ended and to talk about it with audiences that are invested and have information to share with us. So we're looking forward to this. So Invisible Hawkeyes is a collection that really seeks to contemplate the role of the University of Iowa in the civil rights movement. It's not surprising to you, I'm sure, to hear that Iowa City and the University of Iowa is not one of the usual suspects when we talk about the sort of most known moments during the civil rights movement. But that doesn't mean that it's not important, and that's one of the sort of untold stories that we have really enjoyed discovering through this research. So when we think about the paths that African American students traveled to the University of Iowa, the experiences they had here, and the accomplishments they went on to enjoy, when we think about what those mean, we have a really a much more nuanced picture of the way that this institution and the students that came to study here, the African American students that came to study here from the 1930s to about the 1960s, how they impacted the larger struggle for civil rights in this country. So before we turn to the specifics of the cases that we've looked at in those stories, we thought we'd orient, Michael and I thought it might be a good idea to orient all of ourselves sort of to the long arc of the civil rights era to have a better sense of exactly where the University of Iowa fits and where we're placing it within that history. So much of this is probably old news to you, but I'll run through that quickly before we dive into some of the information and stories that we've uncovered here. Oh, and I should say this is Fanny Ellison, and I love this picture of her in front of the state capitol because it reminds me of a present-day selfie for the angle that it's taken from. And I should say that really this project began with our work on Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, one of the most important novels of the 20th century. I think a lot about the visual implications of that novel and Ellison's own interest in visual art, and had published an article on that when I'm forgetting his name, Chris McElron contacted me in 2011 and told me first that he was planning to stage the first adaptation of Invisible Man as a drama, and then went on to say that, well, did you know that his wife, Fanny Ellison, graduated from the University of Iowa in 1936? And I had not previously been aware of that. And it just so happened I was on my way to the Library of Congress to do some research on Ellison. So when I arrived, I immediately sort of dove into the folders on Fanny and discovered a treasure trove of information. I'd also had a great opportunity to work with what was called the Creative Campus Institute that brought professors from different disciplines at the University of Iowa together to think about how we could integrate performance into our classrooms and into our pedagogy. That was a really rich experience that was sponsored by the Center for Teaching and by Hansher. So as a result, I had just met Chuck Swanson. He's a good person to know if you want to put on something big. And so I called him and told him, do you think we could do something on the campus of the University of Iowa? And I remember his first response was, this is cool. And from there, we really just started working with different professors from across the campus and other folks, and it was great. It was really, I think, one of the most exciting examples of collaboration across many disciplines and many units. And that led us to think not just about Fanny's experience, but about other African American students who were here during this period. So that's how we came to the project. So when we think about the civil rights era, it really begins with Plessy v. Ferguson, with Homer Plessy, who was an octoroon living in Louisiana, and his decision to fight what was then separate, what Louisiana had passed a law in 1890 that blacks could not ride in the same cars on trains as whites. So he decided to test this. And of course, he had to tell the conductor he was black, because you can tell from the picture that's not obvious. But when he announced his race, he was told to move from the car that he was sitting in and refused. And this case worked its way up to the Supreme Court and ended in Plessy v. Ferguson, which made segregation the law of the land and constitutional. So during this era, so we're looking sort of at this 58-year span, but when did desegregation really get going? When did we start moving precipitously toward ending segregation? Well, in 1948, Truman, of course, desegregated the armed forces, and then, of course, the landmark decision in 1954, Brown v. Board. Now, the ending of segregation proper, of course, did not end the violence and the resistance that many had as they fought to retain a segregated society, especially in the South and certain Midwestern states. So I just want to put a few dates in our minds. So Brown v. Board passed in 1954. Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955. We had the Little Rock Nine trying to desegregate Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, and of course needing to be escorted by federal troops. And then the sit-in in 1960 by 4 students that attended North Carolina A&T. And so these incidents brought to national attention the fight for civil rights. And of course they were, Emmett Till's murder was captured. His mother wanted those pictures published in Jet magazine, so it was circulated in other magazines as well, circulated widely. And these others were captured on television. And so we really have to remember that TV as a technology really changed and precipitated the movement to end segregation. So what's going on in higher education? James Meredith's case in 1962 to integrate the University of Mississippi's law school reminds us that the NAACP was really getting going at this period because many of the institutions in southern states that didn't accept African Americans, but could make the argument that there were historically black colleges and universities that these students could attend and therefore uphold separate but equal, found themselves on shaky ground when African Americans tried to pursue especially advanced degrees, because there were no separate but equal institutions that they could attend. So James Meredith case was a big deal when it worked its way up through the courts. Violence continued even after the March on Washington, which happened in August of 1963. In September, we had the bombing of the church in Birmingham where 4 little girls were killed, and of course that really rocked the nation. And then the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 ended segregation and any kind of discrimination based on race. So this is what's going on in the nation. These are the currents that we want to place the specific story of the University of Iowa and African American students' experiences here within. So it didn't take the 1954 decision for African Americans to be allowed to pursue an education at the University of Iowa. Alexander Clark was the first African American to receive a degree from the law department in 1879, and Ada Johnson was the first African American woman, along with Letta Bledsoe in 1912, to receive liberal arts degrees from the University of Iowa. So in many ways, the reality of integration looked very different at the University of Iowa when we compare it to what is going on in the nation. And we had a long history of openness that really distinguished the University of Iowa from institutions that were forcibly integrated, but that doesn't mean that the path was always smooth. And Michael and I refer to the challenges that were faced here at our institution as the quieter collisions that mark the civil rights movement. So amidst Iowa's sort of Midwestern nice character, there were still struggles. But even as we take note of the challenges surrounding integration at the State University of Iowa, we want to celebrate the many ways the UI instructed the nation in how to cross the bridge into a truly pluralistic society. And so we want to think about our remarks today in some ways as instructional, and instructional in 2 ways. Instructional in that we really taught the nation how to integrate, and of course things were going on at other places too, but there's a particular story that emerges here when we think of specifically departments of performing arts and athletics, but also instructional in that there was something peculiar about the instructional relationships between largely white male professors who were leading lights in their fields and these African American students. And so just to sort of remind you of just how, in some ways, amazing this time period was, when in December 1955, when Doralee Martin was elected to be Miss State University of Iowa as a black woman who was a freshman at the time, when that happened, that was just 8 days before or after Rosa Parks was arrested and the Montgomery bus boycott began. So that happened in December. She was elected homecoming queen on December 9th. Rosa Parks was arrested December 1st. So that gives you a sense of what a different experience was going on. And Dora Martin Berry was elected by her peers. She was living in Courier at the time. And of course, her African American friends rallied around her and really encouraged her to run. But the white woman in that dorm also voted for her to be the queen, one of the women that would represent their dorm. And she went on to be elected by the entire campus, well, the males, because that's who actually got to vote. I should say that's who got to vote. And we include her testimonial, but it's really, I think, an important way to mark the difference. This is a year, of course, after Emmett Till was brutally murdered. So this starkly dramatizes the chronicle of race relations at the University of Iowa compared to that of the national scene. So Invisible Hawkeyes contends that by looking at UI, we discover a different timeline, a different story, and a more nuanced picture of America's painful conversion into a diverse nation committed to racial equality. As we focus on the stories of a few Black students, we note that far from being marginal, to the progress of UI as a top-ranked university. The story of racial integration sits at the center of the evolution of the State University of Iowa into the flagship institution of higher learning that it is today. Now, Black students who integrated UI's arts departments and athletic programs during the difficult years of the civil rights movement impacted race relations in Iowa City in a special way. And we're often asked, why do we focus on the arts and athletics? Well, the presence of accomplished Black students performing in musical concerts, participating in visual art exhibitions, appearing in theater productions, although for a while they weren't allowed to perform on stage, publishing literature, and competing in sports fields, forced white students, instructors, and administrators to confront the undeniable intellect and talent of African Americans. In contradistinction to the work completed in traditional academic units, these students' contributions to the university community burst beyond the walls of their primary spheres of experience to reach a much larger audience both on campus and beyond its boundaries. Thus, they also enhanced Iowa's emerging status as a forward-thinking, artistic, and athletic powerhouse. And this is true. I often share the story that while we were working on this, and each person was working on a different chapter, I happened to be at my niece's graduation from FAMU in Florida, in Tallahassee at HBCU. And I ran into the North Carolina A&T baseball team. They were staying at the same hotel and were very kind and offered to share their breakfast with us. And so they asked me where I was from, and I said, I teach at the University of Iowa. And the coach said, we know all about Iowa. We've long encouraged students to go there. We have a long history of sending students there and of having people seek advanced degrees there. And I thought it was so interesting that I had to go away from Iowa to have someone tell me that that was our reputation. So why does UI become a destination for African American students? As the nation marched toward mid-century integration, the vast majority of African American students matriculated at HBCUs, at historically Black colleges and universities. A number of factors, however, kept them very much attuned to what was going on in campuses like the University of Iowa. For starters, they were forever struggling to maintain their accreditation and needed to have places where they could seek advanced degrees. Most Black students took advantage of those scholarships that states gave them in order to continue to deny Blacks admissions to their universities. They happily gave them money to pursue their education at places like Iowa. What is more, the school's rapidly growing performing arts departments proved a significant stimulus for African Americans' increasing interest in the State University of Iowa. The Iowa idea that began in the 1920s and the push to award advanced degrees in the arts marked UI as a trailblazer. And this is really true. When you think of our theater department, our fine arts department, the writer's workshop, we really were seen as leaders in these fields. So by the late 1930s and early 1940s, a well-trodden path had emerged between HBCUs and UI. This pipeline flowed both ways, as these students often returned to HBCUs to begin their teaching careers. So there really was this word of mouth where you had professors going back to HBCUs and then encouraging their best and brightest students to go and seek an education at the University of Iowa. Now, an underexplored aspect of their success highlights how these students' achievements both reflect and explain the growing reputation of this University of Iowa, and in particular these fields. So Michael and I want to spend the remainder of our time highlighting incredible stories of collaboration between instructors who were serious scholars and artists, but weren't necessarily civil rights activists. Instead, they were men and women who were devoted to finding the best and the brightest in their fields. And for them, when it came to that, when it came to developing good art and great athletes, they looked beyond race. So they were not necessarily looking to prove something in the arena of civil rights. They were eager to work with talented and gifted students. So I'm going to start looking at it, and I'm going to watch my time. It's usually Michael that is the one that talks longer, but I'm going first, and so I'm gonna be respectful. It's great to be able to work with one's partner. Our kids sometimes say too much talk about the same things, but it keeps things interesting. Okay. On July 18th, 1936, Fanny wrote to President Bluford at North Carolina A&T, a historically black college in Greensboro. She opened her letter by highlighting her credentials and closed her missive by offering to provide a reference from Miss Helen Blattner, University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa. Her determination to draw attention to her work at Iowa reflects both her awareness of the cutting-edge nature of the UI theater program, as well as the unique position she held as a black graduate from the institution in 1936. She seemed confident that her professor would attest to her capacity for producing good work in the realm of drama. Fanny clearly understood the importance of her work with respected scholars in the field. She graduated from Iowa feeling fully prepared to contribute to the world of theater. She returned to Chicago, where she began working for Susan Glaspell under the auspices of the Federal Theater Project. Glaspell wrote to E.C. Mabie, the eccentric head of the UI Theater Department, quote, "This morning a Miss Fanny McConnell, a Negro, came in to talk to me about play reading. She tells me that she is from the University of Iowa and has worked in the dramatic department. I found her intelligent and think she can be helpful to us, especially as we need her viewpoint in the selection of plays for our Negro theater." Fanny used her relationship with her white instructors at Iowa as a calling card to gain entrance into the world of theater. Yet while at Iowa, she did not shy away from stating her mind in order to maintain easy relations with her professors. In one essay where she evaluated John Drinkwater's Bird in the Hand, she declared, "Bird in the Hand was not a very provocative play. One saw it and immediately forgot it." Her professor's notes in the margin suggested he agreed. She was no stranger to working with well-known professors. Before coming to Iowa, she studied at Fisk and served as the personal secretary to Harlem Renaissance leader and writer James Weldon Johnson. At Iowa, she was part of the costume crew of Iowa alum Richard Mabham's Birthright, his anti-Nazi play he produced in 1935. And Mabham's a big deal. His master's thesis was called The Tree, and that play went on to be the first anti-lynching play to be produced on Broadway, and then he came back to Iowa to teach here, and so Fanny, working with him, was well aware of what it meant to produce drama that really had meaning as far as its the possibility of impacting society. When Fanny left Iowa City in 1936, the door to pursuing master's and doctoral degrees in theater swung open more widely to prospective African-American students. E.C. Mabie continued to serve as department chair during this period, and he was deeply committed to advancing the degree programs in the arts and strove to establish a regional theater. And this was his passion, and he was passionate about bringing African American students into the program because he said, if New York wants authentic theater, because he really felt Broadway didn't capture what it really was to be an American, they'll have to look to Iowa to have a sense of Midwestern character, and they'll have to look to places like us that are willing to develop African Americans who will create plays that represent African American culture authentically and realistically. His passion bore fruit in the form of increased opportunities for Black students to secure the credentials necessary for establishing and expanding their degrees at historically Black universities and colleges. I want to just talk a little bit about Thomas Pawley before I turn things over to Michael. He's one student who I had the pleasure of interviewing when he was 97 years old. He just passed away in August. He was here at the University of Iowa with Tennessee Williams. I was one of his peers. When he arrived to Iowa City in 1937, he really wanted to be an actor, but Mabie asked him, what are you going to act in? You're going to have to write some plays that actually feature African-American characters. And that really put Pawley on a different trajectory artistically. And he really says that's why I went into playwriting. He describes his theater work at Iowa as immensely practical and often exciting, but he really didn't view Mabie as a mentor in the traditional way. And this gets to the idea of the specific kind of collaboration that we've uncovered. He laughingly recalled Mabie as the boss, and this is how Mabie was fondly referred to in the theater department. But he said, he often pushed against me. When he produced different plays, so for his master's, he produced 3 plays. I've featured 2 because his master's thesis in special collections has photographs from these plays. Pawley recalls Mabie's objection to his play Smokey, which he said was just pure propaganda and pushed him to do more with it. By the same token, we see the play Jedgement Day, which was performed in blackface. When I asked Pawley about it, he just laughed and said, "Oh, that was for comic relief." And this is interesting because he went on to be quite active in the civil rights movement, but it gives you a sense of the complicated reality of their studies at the university during this period. Pawley describes his time at Iowa as a time of collaboration that allowed his artistic voice to develop and his sense of aesthetic agency and individuality to emerge. He was proud to be inducted into the Purple Mass Society, an honorary group that was originally founded in 1922 by Mabie, and nominations were given to faculty, and they actually decided who would be admitted. You had to have a 3.0, but it was a very prestigious society, and he was very, very honored to be in it. His plays exhibit his enduring interest in studying Black male character in radically different American settings, and this is a theme he continued to investigate throughout his career. His probing explorations of African American men unfold against the lived reality of his experiences at the University of Iowa as both a master's and doctoral student. So he returned actually to finish his PhD, but he was planning to go to Yale. He called Mabie for a letter of recommendation, and at that time, Mabie said, "I'm not going to give it to you because I want you to come here to pursue your doctorate," and that's why he ended up returning to the University of Iowa. So this what's going on in the theater department was also going on in the Department of Music, which Brian Halstus describes in his chapter, collaborations between figures like Philip G. Clapp and Oscar Anderson Fuller Jr., as well as in the Department of Graphic and Plastic Arts. And the famous Grant Wood was really seminal in working with Elizabeth Catlett and fighting to make sure that she received her MFA. So these are just a few of the stories of collaboration that formed the heart of the larger narrative of African American student success at the University of Iowa, and as well as the success of our institution.
So Lena has captured and offered a capacious account of what I call the context of democratic collaboration. We have a thick description of the backdrop against which human dramas are unfolding. But quite often within the world of the discussion of desegregation, we focus only on the surface, the threshold, the space before actually entering the guts of interaction across racial lines. What I want to do today is to briefly explore the Iowa Writers' Workshop as a site of democratic collaboration, a space where democracy unfolded in interpersonal contact between human beings who were flawed on both sides of that encounter, but nonetheless were able to come together in order to achieve transcendent artistic production, even at the same moment as the consequences of their interactions sometimes were not utterly fulfilling for both people who were involved in the interaction. So this is a messier expose of how you interact and what happens when you aspire toward that unruly thing, which is a pluralistic, participatory democracy. By way of offering this account, I want to talk briefly about a trio of individuals, but spend the vast majority of my time focusing on the interrelationship between Margaret Walker and the head of the Iowa Writers' Workshop at that time, Paul Engel. Oh, you already had it up. So, Herbert Nipson, who's here at the far side of the slide, interacts and emerges from history for a couple of very potent reasons. Herbert Nipson becomes the editor of Ebony magazine in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. He's functioning as an editor at Ebony from 1949 in various ways, but he becomes the chief editor at Ebony magazine by the time we get to the 1970s and the 1980s. His interconnection with the University of Iowa is scarcely acknowledged by the university or outside of the university. This becomes fascinating to me because Ebony exists as one of the central taste-making organs of African-American culture in this country. It could be argued that Ebony magazine may be more influential in the development of the black bourgeoisie sensibility than almost any other publication, certainly any mass market publication. And the editor of that magazine graduates from the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop. However, up until the current moment, his existence in that space is underdocumented. So one of the questions that arises is, how does Nipson imagine his sojourn within the space of the University of Iowa? How does he view his own experience here? And what kinds of conclusions can we reach about the fact that he occupied a space here? That before he became a decision maker within the world of black taste making, within the world of black consumer culture, indisputably, by the time we get to the latter portions of the 20th century, what does it mean that he performs an apprenticeship of sorts at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and his aesthetic sensibility is shaped through contact with individuals like Paul Engle? Likewise, at an opposite end of the chronological spectrum, Nipson is at the Iowa Writers' Workshop from 1945 to 1949. At a different end of the spectrum of what we contemplate within the world of invisible Hawkeyes, you have a figure like Michael Harper, who arrives at the Iowa Writers' Workshop in 1961, leaves in 1962. And unlike Nipson, Harper is not bathed in obscurity. He's understood as being one of the leading lights of a poetic movement that emerges at the tail end of the 1960s and gains all the more traction by the time we get to the 1970s. Harper is understood as being a central figure in the unfolding of a group of black writers who are known as the new breed, individuals who are using jazz music in particular in order to try to create a specific approach to creativity. What's fascinating here is that dissonant aesthetic sensibilities are being nurtured in the same institution. Michael Harper doesn't write like Herbert Nipson. Michael Harper's sensibility is not tied directly to Herbert Nipson's. But what we see is Iowa sitting at the center of a range of black expressive possibilities and operating within that space as a nurturing educational opportunity. So how is it that Herb Nipson and Michael Harper, exemplars of different aesthetic sensibilities, can both come to the University of Iowa and be productively, if not overwhelmingly, laudatorily educated there, right? Like they both have moments where they're got complicated moments, a complicated relationship with their alma mater. How is it that they can both be nurtured there? What I want to do by way of exploring this is to look at the interrelationship between Margaret Walker and Paul Engle. Margaret Walker's time at the University of Iowa brackets, or frames, I should say, the matriculation of both Herb Nipson and Michael Harper. She's here at the University of Iowa, first of all, in 1939, and then she graduates in 1940. That's 7 years before Herbert Nipson enrolled at the University of Iowa. After briefly revisiting campus in 1961, she also begins her PhD studies during the fall of 1962, a mere 8 months after Michael Harper left town. So she sits both before Nipson arrives on campus and after Harper departs campus. Harper leaving in 62, Nipson arriving in 45, and Walker spreading around those two. why do people return to the University of Iowa? It's one thing to contemplate their arrival at the University of Iowa, Thomas Pawley being an example. It's one thing for someone to come and to decide that they want to pursue an advanced degree within this environment, but what is it that leads one to return to the University of Iowa? What I want to suggest by talking a bit about the relationship between Margaret Walker and Paul Engle is the complicated negotiations that sit at the center of their decision, especially for Black students, to return to this space and to participate in this space with an awareness. The first time she comes, she doesn't understand what it is that she's walking into. The second time she comes, just as Thomas Pawley did, she enters a space that she understands exactly what it is that she will encounter as she visits this spot. Walker's status as a figure that wraps around Nipson and Harper may be a matter of coincidence. However, her status in an exploration of Iowa's impact on mid-century Black culture rests on intentionality as opposed to serendipity. If Wilbur Schramm, the first head of the workshop, pegs its birth in 1936, then Steve Wilbers, the most thoroughgoing historian of the Iowa Writers' Workshop, suggests that the summer of 1939 was the moment when the entire enterprise coalesced in its modern form. There are no records of Black students in the precursor English department courses from which the workshop germinated. And since Walker began her studies in the summer of 1939, she is perhaps the first Black individual to ever study in the Iowa Writers' Workshop. While the importance of that racial first may have been neglected by history, Walker's centrality to the post-Harlem Renaissance, pre-naturalist, realist school of Black writing has not been overlooked. Despite such recognition, most, if not all, of the analyses of Walker have ignored how her Iowa years fit into her artistic gestation. The culture that she experienced and the cultural experience that she brought to Iowa constitute an interesting example of cross-fertilization, and one that I argue become the basis of a narrative that echoes not only across the state, but also to the larger levels of democratic aspiration within this nation. Those kinds of cross-fertilizations are not always taking place in smooth interactions. Walker has an interest as she emerges within the world of the Iowa Writers' Workshop in exploring a fiction career. She really comes here to write a story about her family slave past. But she arrives in 1939, and in interaction with Engle, she finds an instructor with whom she experiences productive friction. She's sitting in classes, and Engle is offering observations, and the observations are catching her imagination. They're snagging in her mind in certain ways, and as they're snagging in her mind, she is both intrigued and angered. She is both fascinated and interested. So instead of pursuing a fiction career during her first movement through the workshop, she decides instead that she wants to study with Paul Engle and that she wants to pursue a poetry career. She's already written poems. She's already a published poet by the time she arrives at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, but that was not the genre of choice that she had in mind when she came into the workshop. It is the figure of Paul Engle, the complicated figure of Paul Engle, and the prospect of interaction with him that leads her to decide that she would prefer to write a poetry thesis as opposed to writing a fiction thesis. So she didn't arrive at the Iowa Workshop as a household name, but she did come in with some experience. She had publications under her belt. She had been introduced to the leading lights of the Black literary world. She knew Langston Hughes. She knew W.E.B. Du Bois. She had interacted with individuals of that sort. And as she entered Paul Engle's classroom, what she found in Engle was someone who was committed to the vocation of writing, and who had a fascinating interest in the craft of writing. But as they began to interact with one another, specifically as Ingle began to offer Walker a set of observations and admonitions with regard to her artistic consciousness, this is the moment at which the messiness of democratic collaboration begins to emerge. And one story that exemplifies this messiness centers on Ingle's suggestion that Walker develop her use of the ballad form. So she is writing poems, and Ingle's initial reaction is, these poems are too angry. These poems are too bitter. Why don't you choose a different form? Why don't you write a nice ballad about a Negro preacher, a happy Negro preacher? So he offered his admonition to the wrong person. First of all, Margaret Walker's father is a preacher. And secondly, Margaret Walker is deeply interested in the ballad form, not as a sentimental or lyrical exhibition, but ultimately as the site of protest possibility. So this is a moment where Ingle and Walker discover the possibility of productive fiction. Remembering it in a 1971 letter, looking back, Walker writes that we were an enigmatic group, a strange aggregation at the level of students, and an even more peculiar person who was occupying the position of being a teacher. You were an odd person, but the angles at which we intersected made me a better artist. And what I would like to conclude by observing is that this is not only the story of writers at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. This is not only the story of Margaret Walker, a black woman from the South who emerges within the white institution of the Iowa Writers' Workshop and encounters Paul Ingle, but this is also the story that echoes challengingly to the present day. How can individuals with radically different experiences find common ground to collaborate on efforts that can have transcendent impact, not only locally, but also nationally? This is the lesson that I learned during the course of conducting the research that I did with regard to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. It's not always smooth. In fact, the collaboration sometimes is disastrously difficult. Some people run kicking and screaming from the enterprise, both instructors and students. But what Margaret Walker evidences is the recurrent possibility for an interracial collaboration that can help the nation discover the possibilities of its better self. And at the current moment, I would submit that these are lessons that we need to study quite carefully. Thank you.
Michael and Lena have admirably left time for questions and comments. Do we have a microphone we need to pass around?
We'll restate the questions at the microphone.
Okay, so yeah, if you, when you come up, if you'd restate the question that's here. So what questions, comments do you have?
I was interested in the, so the southern states paid African American students to go somewhere else to get a degree, is that?
Yes, so that's exactly right. And it's a strange thing, and often it wasn't a lot, so they still struggled when they went out of state, because of course it's always more expensive to study away from your home than it is to stay at home. And of course, for a long time in those early years before, 1945, Black students couldn't stay on campus here. So that made it an extra difficulty for them to pursue their education at the University of Iowa. But one thing that's very interesting that we discovered in talking to a lot of those students is that the struggles such as not being able to live on campus that they discovered here actually added to the sense of community that they formed. So you would think that many times you are interviewing students who came to the university when things were much more difficult even than they are now, and we always try to put these things in perspective when we're teaching our students today. But they talk about stories of, arriving to the train station and having other Black students who would know when new students were arriving and would greet them at the train station and would drive them around town at night until they found a place for them to stay. And the kind of community and friendships that grew from that necessary community forming. And I think this even goes forward. Now, some have, I think, more difficult times reckoning with the experience here. Fanny Ellison rarely had positive things to say. Even a few weeks ago when Dora Martin-Berry was here, she laughingly would tell us that her husband, Hank, who was here with her, who she met here, was on the baseball team and it really said even now he doesn't feel comfortable speaking about his experiences because he still feels angry at the thought of traveling with the team but having to sleep with the bus driver instead of with his teammates. And these kinds of experiences have left him quite bitter. So yes, they were given money to pursue their education elsewhere rather than have a lawsuit. I mean, much of this was right just to keep them quiet so that things could continue to go as they were in these segregated states.
Others?
I have a question about, I love this passage about an aesthetic, and I don't know if I can phrase the question quite right, but this idea of something that's deeply personal, like rage, self-hatred, hatred of the other, as an aesthetic that you identify as authentic, and then that process of transcendence. Can you just give more specific examples of that creative aesthetic process so that it might answer your own question? Because I liked your question in terms of, and does it relate to a higher truth?
Restate the question as you understand.
That might be the most difficult part of this, right? So does an aesthetic of rage and an aesthetic of rejection and the working through or the transcendence of an aesthetic of rage and rejection, does it relate to a higher truth, or is it connected somehow to a higher truth? The individual that I would point to in exploring that would be Michael Harper in particular. Harper talked about Iowa City with regard to a tutelage in democracy. But what he believed is that Iowa taught him the worst elements of the democratic spirit that he was ever exposed to up until that point. He came from Los Angeles, and when he came out to the University of Iowa, when he entered the Iowa Writers' Workshop, the apparatus, the scaffolding of his disdain was the housing situation. And this comes up over and over again for individuals as they enter this space. Even Nipson talks about the difficulty of finding housing in Iowa City. He was married at the moment that he came. He came in the aftermath of World War II. He was a part of that group of individuals who were coming back on the GI Bill, so they were excited about that prospect. But the housing crunch, which we still see even to this day, people talking about, produced some nasty attitudes with regard to the housing situation. So people could decide capriciously to rent a room, but then not rent a room when other tenants came along. And Harper said that taught him, if we're going to talk about an aesthetics of hatred on some level, that taught him the nastiest possibilities within the realm of market capitalism, right? Is that ostensibly we're making decisions on the basis of availability and scarcity, but what he said is that there was an overlayering of race that was all too frequently ignored in terms of the way that people were interacting with one another. What became interesting in the case of Harper is that his workshop experiences, unlike with Ingle and Walker, were not productive friction. It was all friction, right? Like every instructor that he had, from Verlin Castle, Don Justice, to Paul Ingle himself, every single one of them, when he ran into them, he was like, you don't understand. You don't know what I'm trying to do. You know, what you're saying doesn't fit even my conception of my artistry. You're not responding to me in a way that acknowledges my humanity. You're responding to me as if I'm some form that you're trying to critique in some way. Retrospectively, when he talked about that experience, what he appreciated most was the fact that they allowed him to blunder in his own way. They didn't kick him out of the program. They didn't say, oh, you're not, suited to be here. He said, but the license to blunder was the index of their humanity for him. He looked at them and he said, wow, these people didn't say that's a crazy black dude and he needs to be, removed from this program. What they said is, maybe he's right. Maybe we don't know what to do with him. Maybe we have no idea what it is that will nurture his artistry, except we do know that it's better for him to be here, trying to be an artist, than not to have this space in which to essay that opportunity. And Harper ultimately came to appreciate that very deeply about the University of Iowa, that it was a space where you were allowed to blunder in your own way. And that even as you blundered and others blundered in epic ways sometimes, that the fundamental commitment to the creative process was never really reversed and never revoked. And I think that sits at the center of something that Lena was talking about earlier with regard to one engine of this university, especially in its development from the 1930s to the 1960s, and perhaps even to this day, is that what is sacred, if there's a bigger truth, I think, if this university has some church-like ethic, then it is the commitment to creative process. That's the thing that we believe most deeply in Iowa City, is a dedication to the creative process, the sacrosanct nature of that particular attempt and attempting.
Yeah, I'll just add to that by saying it is very interesting that these students came to a profoundly white space and produced deep and searching pieces of art that explored African American culture and experience. And sometimes it was through rage, sometimes it was through a reflection on their own difficulties they were having. When you look at something like Pawley's dissertation, it was on Crispus Attucks. And he really went back. It was he wanted to take a historical incident and a historical man, black man, and to enlarge it and to imagine, right, all that might have gone along with what it would mean to be the man that started the Revolutionary War, to be a black man. But he wasn't. When you look at their classes, when I look at Fanny Ellison's notes, she's taking British drama. Right, she's taking what you would expect one to take at the University of Iowa in the 30s. But what they go on to produce, Fanny went on to found the Negro People's Theater, and I just wanted to read, because she's very young. She's an undergraduate. She goes on to found the Negro People's Theater in Chicago, and this is what she says. I'm going to read from a letter she writes to the other African-American young people who are forming this theater to speak to the concerns of Chicago African-Americans and African-Americans throughout the country at this time. She says, a permanent theater for the Negro people represents an immense ideal, an ideal which has long, long been neglected. Certainly the Negro has as much to say as any other peoples on the face of the earth. What is wanted, what you must surely agree is needed, is a theater in which the plays that are vital and significant unto us as human beings, not martyrs or mountebanks, but just mere human beings who hunger and love and fight as normal people of any race or creed. That's what their education at the University of Iowa gave them the power to do and to create. And it really goes so far beyond Iowa City when we think about the impact of their art.
Back.
Thank you. The book is wonderful and a great contribution. I know you focus on the humanities and the arts. Can you talk a little bit, though, I know I'm coming towards the end, can you talk a little bit about the social sciences and sciences or other fields? Can you tell us the sort of collaboration that you're seeing in the arts and humanities? Does that also carry over, as far as you know so far, to the other disciplines?
Sure.
And then, what role, and Michael and I have had this conversation briefly, but what role does the graduate college and the dean of the graduate college have in creating this environment?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the first question is, do departments or units outside of fine arts and athletics also participate in the kind of dynamic interracial collaboration that we see in those parts of campus? And two, infrastructure. A question of who are the key administrators that enable these things to take place? What is it that happens? How is it that black students can arrive on this campus and actually matriculate through 2-year programs, 3-year programs, 4-year programs? What is it that allows them to do that? Who are the administrators? Are there any names? Are there faces that we can draw our attention to? So on the first question, I'll just allude to 2 areas very quickly. In the sciences, Jewel Prestige's a key figure as far as our ability to do the work that we did from the humanities standpoint, like from a particular humanities standpoint. She's a political scientist. She takes a PhD in political science, the first black woman to take a PhD in political science, we think, in the United States, and she takes it here at the University of Iowa. But her husband is actually a PhD in the hard sciences. And they both are teaching later at Prairie View University. And her husband is the second Prairie View University professor to take a PhD from the University of Iowa. He's actually sent to the University of Iowa by his department chair, who's already taken a PhD in the hard sciences. So that illustrates to some extent that maybe even earlier in the hard sciences, these kind of pipeline dynamics were already in place. Jewel Prestige's husband becomes the head of the first computer laboratory in Louisiana, the first, and it's on a black college campus. He has training that makes him the supervisor to all other individuals in the state of Louisiana, right? When they're trying to figure out how to use the computer lab, how to incorporate these ideas into the educational environment because of what he's exposed to at the University of Iowa, he, at a historically black college and university, is the one they have to call to say, hey, can you come tell us how to implement this at LSU? Can you come tell us how to implement this in some of our flagship universities? Coming to the question of who performs the unlocking of the gate, as it were, Carl Seashore. He's the individual who, first of all, pioneers the belief that creative work at the University of Iowa or at any university should be treated on the same level as any other kind of work. So Seashore is instrumental in making that claim over and over again, not just here at the University of Iowa, but also in national meetings. He's saying it to his peers and saying, look, we need to do this. We need to formalize the possibility for individuals to get credentials for doing work like orchestras, for individuals to get credentials for doing works like creative writing. We need to be on the board. And when Seashore ascends to a position of authority at the University of Iowa, one of the first things that he does is to say, look, we need to operationalize this. This is not something that we should talk about theoretically. We need to operationalize it. And I think that he also makes it possible for strong department heads like Maybe and Clapp to get the material resources that will allow their students to matriculate. So.